She was a powerful CEO. He was just the janitor in her building. One night she asked him for something unbelievable. Pretend you love me for 7 minutes. What happened next will stay with you. Share your thoughts in the comments and make sure to subscribe for more stories like this. The marble floor of Horizon Tower gleamed under the fluorescent lights. It was nearly midnight, and silence pressed against the glass walls of the 33rd floor. Victoria Hale stood in her corner office, her arms folded, her gaze fixed not on the city lights outside, but on the man pushing a mop cart with steady precision. Daniel Ross moved as if time had slowed just for him. There was a quiet dignity in the way he worked, the kind of peace that comes only when someone has been broken and forced to rebuild with what little is left. She had watched him for weeks now, pretending it was just idle curiosity. But tonight, there was no denying it. She was searching for courage in his steadiness. Her heels clicked softly against the marble as she stepped out of her office. Daniel looked up, and in that instant, their worlds collided. His steel blue eyes locked onto hers, not the polished mask she wore for boardrooms and investors, but the fragile woman hidden underneath. Victoria swallowed, her voice steadier than her heart. "I need to ask you something," she began, the words almost foreign on her tongue. "Tomorrow night there's an event, something I can't face alone." She paused. The request felt absurd even before she said it. "I need you to pretend to love me just for 7 minutes." The mop handle stilled beneath his calloused hands. A former engineer turned janitor, a man who had once designed engines, now reduced to cleaning hallways. Daniel should have laughed at the absurdity, but he didn't. He studied her face, the flawless makeup, the perfectly styled blonde hair, the expensive suit that served as armor. And beneath it all, he saw what no magazine cover would ever reveal: loneliness, a woman drowning in silence despite her empire of glass and steel. 7 minutes, he repeated, his voice low, measured, carrying the weight of someone who had learned to be careful with promises. She nodded, but her hands trembled slightly at her sides. He tilted his head, his tone gentler than he intended. "May I ask why?" Victoria turned toward the floor-to-ceiling windows. The city stretched below them like a glowing circuit board, beautiful yet cold. "Because tomorrow they'll ask about my personal life," she whispered, "and I can't give them the truth. The truth is, I go home to an empty penthouse, eat takeout, and bury myself in quarterly reports." Her confession hung in the air, fragile and aching. Daniel felt it settle in his chest, the way grief recognizes grief. He knew the echo of empty rooms, dinners eaten in silence, the weight of absence pressing against walls. For him, it was the loss of a wife, a career, a future. For her, it was a life consumed by power and isolation. Different roads, same emptiness. He set the mop aside, straightened slowly, and after a long silence, he nodded. "All right," he said, 7 minutes. And for the first time in years, Victoria Hale allowed herself to breathe. Daniel lay awake long after he'd left Horizon Tower that night. The hum of the city outside his small apartment window faded into the background as he replayed Victoria Hale's words. "Pretend you love me." Just for 7 minutes. It should have sounded laughable, ridiculous even, but it didn't. Her voice had carried something raw, something too fragile to be ignored. He pushed himself up from the couch, rubbing his hands over his face. His eyes wandered to the small bedroom down the hall, where a soft glow spilled out beneath the door. Mia was asleep, her steady breathing a comfort that never failed him. 7 years old, all curls and questions, she was the only anchor left in a life that had once been so different. Daniel walked quietly to her doorway, leaning against the frame as he watched her sleep. She clutched a worn stuffed rabbit to her chest, its seams stretched thin from years of love. Her drawings, castles, stars, and rocket ships, were taped unevenly across the walls, bright colors fighting against the drab paint of the apartment. He remembered the man he used to be, a young aerospace engineer, standing beside prototypes of engines that carried his name on the schematics. He had built things that soared, that cut through clouds, that promised futures. But all it had taken was one decision to speak up about safety violations, one lawsuit that dragged his name through the mud, and everything collapsed like a tower of cards. The company had stripped him of his career. The legal fees drained every cent of their savings. And then came the cruelest blow, the night his wife never came home, the accident that left Mia motherless and him broken. For 3 years, he had traded blueprints for mop handles, boardrooms for hallways where no one looked him in the eye. He kept his head down, told himself dignity could be found in doing any job well, even this one. But dignity didn't buy Mia new shoes when hers wore thin. Dignity didn't pay for better schools or the piano lessons she begged for. Money mattered, and Victoria Hale's offer, whatever it was, carried the weight of change. Yet, it wasn't just the promise of payment that kept gnawing at him. It was her eyes. He had seen 1,000 polished faces pass through Horizon Tower, all clipped voices and expensive perfumes, but hers that night had cracked in a single moment. The woman known for being untouchable had looked unbearably human. She had reminded him of himself, staring at an empty chair across the dinner table, filling silence with numbers and reports. Loneliness wore many disguises, but Daniel had learned to recognize it in others as surely as he recognized it in himself. He moved into the living room, sat heavily at the table littered with Mia's crayons and half-finished homework sheets. One of her drawings lay on top, a house with smoke curling from the chimney, stick figures holding hands in front, one tall, one small, and one with long hair. He traced it with his finger, his throat tightening. Maybe Mia had always been wiser than him. Maybe she already knew what he hadn't been brave enough to admit, that they needed more than survival. They needed connection. Daniel leaned back, exhaling slowly. Tomorrow night, he would step into a suit that didn't belong to him, into a world that had forgotten men like him existed. And for 7 minutes, he would hold the hand of a woman who ruled that world, yet longed for something real. He didn't know what would come after. He only knew that for the first time in years, he was about to say yes, not just for the money, but because sometimes a stranger's desperation mirrors your own. He glanced once more toward Mia's door, then whispered into the quiet apartment, "All right, Victoria Hale, 7 minutes it is." The mirror hardly recognized him, and neither did he. The midnight blue suit fit like it had been cut for his frame alone, its subtle sheen catching the low light of the apartment. Daniel adjusted the tie with unsteady fingers. His calloused hands, more familiar with grease and mop water, looked strangely at home against the crisp fabric. For a moment, he felt like an actor about to step onto a stage with no script. Only this time, the audience was filled with people who measured worth in power and profit, not in the quiet resilience of a janitor. At the base of Horizon Tower, security did a double take before checking his name on the guest list. It still felt surreal. Then the elevator doors opened and there she was, Victoria Hale. Gone was the severe suit of the boardroom. In its place, a dress the color of emeralds, shimmering softly under the lights. The hue pulled green flecks from her hazel eyes, and though her posture remained impeccable, Daniel sensed the tension beneath it, like a violin string pulled too tight. She gave him a small smile, one that faltered at the edges. "You clean up nice," she murmured. The elevator rose silently, carrying them toward the penthouse level, where the gala unfolded. Daniel tugged at his cuff, his nerves betraying him. "What's our story?" he asked. Victoria didn't miss a beat. "We met at a coffee shop," she said smoothly. "You were reading a book about engineering, and I asked about it. We've been seeing each other for 2 months. Her voice softened, almost wistful, as though she wanted to believe it herself. "And if they ask about the future?" Daniel pressed. She hesitated, then looked straight ahead. "Tell them we're taking it one day at a time." The doors opened to a room drenched in crystal light and murmured wealth. Chandeliers scattered rainbows across marble floors. Men in tailored suits and women draped in diamonds moved like currents in a glittering sea. Daniel inhaled slowly, felt Victoria's hand slip into his, warm and trembling. 7 minutes, he reminded her under his breath. She nodded, though something flickered in her eyes, a fleeting shadow of disappointment. They entered the crowd together, and at first, he thought of it as nothing more than an elaborate performance. He shook hands, smiled politely, followed Victoria's lead. But then something shifted. The conversations about innovation and markets tugged at the dormant engineer in him, and his responses were more than polite filler. They were genuine. Victoria laughed at something he said, not the rehearsed laugh she wore for investors, but one that escaped from somewhere real. The sound startled them both. Time stretched. 7 minutes slipped into 15, then 30. Daniel found himself moving through the crowd as though he belonged, though deep down he knew he didn't. What unnerved him more was the way Victoria kept looking at him when she thought no one else noticed. The softness in her gaze, the pride in her voice when she introduced him, the way her hand lingered on his arm like it wasn't part of a contract, but something she wanted. Then came the moment that undid him. An elderly board member asked Victoria what made her so certain about this man by her side. Victoria turned, her eyes searching Daniel's face with quiet intensity, and with a tenderness that made his breath catch, she answered simply, "He sees me." Those 3 words hung in the air, heavier than crystal chandeliers, truer than any deal sealed in that room. Daniel felt the weight of them lodge in his chest, because in that moment, he understood this wasn't acting anymore. Pretending to love Victoria Hale had begun to feel dangerously close to the most honest thing he'd done in years. The air on the balcony was cooler, thinner somehow, carrying the scent of rain that hadn't yet fallen. Daniel stepped out first, grateful for the quiet after the dizzying whirl of chandeliers and champagne glasses. He braced his hands on the stone railing, staring at the sweep of Chicago skyline glittering below. For a moment, it felt like standing between 2 worlds, the one that sparkled beneath him and the one he carried inside, lined with worn shoes by the door and bedtime stories whispered to a child who still believed in magic. The door clicked open behind him, and then she was there. Victoria Hale, emerald gown brushing against the tile, heels soft against the floor. She didn't carry herself like the CEO who commanded rooms with a glance. Out here, in the shadow of the city lights, she looked smaller somehow, as though the weight of her empire had been left inside. She leaned on the railing a few feet away, exhaling a breath she seemed to have held all night. "Thank you," she said quietly. He turned his head, surprised by the gentleness in her voice. "For what?" "For making me feel normal," she admitted, her gaze fixed on the maze of lights below. "For a little while in there, I wasn't the woman every headline expects me to be. I wasn't the Hale Empire or quarterly reports or succession plans. I was just someone standing beside another person, laughing like it mattered." Her words carried a tremor, fragile yet unflinchingly honest. Daniel studied her profile, the way her hair caught the faint shimmer of the city glow, the way her shoulders eased for the first time since he'd met her. Something inside him shifted. This wasn't the same woman he'd agreed to help for 7 minutes. This wasn't the untouchable figure on magazine covers. This was a woman confessing loneliness. And in her confession, he recognized his own. He wanted to tell her he understood, that he too went home to rooms that echoed with silence that pressed against his chest. He wanted to tell her about Mia's drawings taped to cracked walls, how those little splashes of color were the only proof that love still lived under his roof. Instead, he found himself saying softly, "You're welcome." Silence stretched between them, but it wasn't the cold kind. It was the silence that hums with things unspoken, with truths hovering just beyond reach. Daniel felt her hand graze the railing closer to his, not quite touching, but near enough to make his pulse quicken. He thought about the deal they'd made, 7 minutes of pretending. But out here on this balcony, there was no script, no audience, only a woman trembling with the relief of being seen, and a man realizing he no longer knew where pretending ended and truth began. Victoria finally turned, her hazel eyes luminous, threaded with something that looked almost like fear. "This is crazy," she whispered, almost to herself. Daniel's voice was steady when he answered, "Maybe, but it feels real." Her lips parted as though to argue, but nothing came. The city spread out behind them like a living witness, and the space between them closed without either of them moving. For the first time that night, Daniel wasn't counting minutes, and for the first time in years, Victoria wasn't performing. She was simply a woman standing in the cool night air, allowing herself to be human. And somewhere deep inside, Daniel knew whatever line they had drawn had already blurred beyond recognition. The morning after the gala, Daniel slipped back into his uniform, trading the tailored suit for gray coveralls that smelled faintly of bleach and dust. Horizon Tower looked the same as it always did, polished marble and glass that reflected perfection. But something inside him had shifted. He pushed his cart down the executive hall, forcing himself to ignore the ache that came with memory. The warmth of her hand, the tremor in her laugh, the way her eyes had softened when the crowd wasn't watching. At his locker, he found an envelope resting neatly on the shelf, his name written in precise, elegant handwriting. Inside was payment, more than generous, more than he had expected, and a single note. Thank you. Two words that should have satisfied him, but instead left a hollow sting. Money meant new shoes for Mia, maybe even a weekend where the bills didn't weigh so heavy. But the envelope also drew a line, as if what had passed between them could be neatly filed under transaction. He slipped it back into his locker, the metallic clang echoing louder than it should. Days passed. He kept his head down, mopping the endless corridors, pretending that night had been nothing but an unusual job. Yet every time the elevator chimed, he found himself listening for the click of her heels. It happened on a Wednesday afternoon, when the lobby was quieter than usual. He looked up, and there she was, Victoria Hale, not in armor of silk and diamonds, but in jeans and a soft sweater. She looked almost unrecognizable, as though she'd borrowed someone else's life for the day. I came to return the suit, she said, holding a garment bag, but her eyes lingered on his face, searching, questioning. Daniel reached for the bag, his voice even. You could have sent it with security. She gave a small shrug, awkward in its honesty. I wanted to make sure it fit properly for next time. The words hung between them, charged with possibility. Before he could respond, a familiar voice piped up from a corner table. Daddy, Mia called, waving a crayon-stained hand. She sat with her homework spread out across the marble, her legs swinging restlessly under the chair. Daniel had arranged with security to let her wait there after school until his shift ended. Her dark eyes widened when she saw Victoria, curiosity lighting her expression. This is Miss Hale, Daniel introduced carefully, pride slipping into his tone. She works upstairs. Mia smiled shyly, then pushed a sheet of paper toward them. A drawing, bold lines and bright colors filled with towers and windows. It's a castle, she explained, but it's lonely because only one person lives in it. Victoria knelt beside her, the emerald polish gone, her hands resting lightly on the edge of the table. Maybe, she said gently, the person in the castle just needs to learn how to open the door. Mia considered this with the seriousness only a child could muster. Then, with a flourish, she picked up a purple crayon and drew a wide, glowing doorway at the base of the castle. There, she announced proudly, now people can come visit. Her eyes darted between her father and Victoria with innocent wisdom. Daddy, she said matter-of-factly, you should invite Miss Hale to dinner. She looks like she doesn't get invited to things very much. Daniel froze, caught between the world he had built and the one he'd been too afraid to imagine. Victoria's soft laugh broke the silence, not polished, not practiced, but real. And for the first time in days, Daniel felt something dangerous stir inside him again. Hope. Victoria hesitated at the base of the narrow stairwell, garment bag still in her hand, as though one more step might cross a line she couldn't return from. The building was nothing like Horizon Tower. Here the walls were lined with faded paint, and the faint aroma of someone's cooking drifted through the halls. Yet when Daniel opened the door and Mia's laughter spilled out, something inside her softened. The apartment was small, but it radiated warmth. Photographs of Mia lined the shelves, gap-toothed smiles, birthday candles. School art projects were clipped to the refrigerator with magnets shaped like stars. The kitchen was alive with motion, pots simmering, plates set carefully by Mia herself. We're having spaghetti, Daniel said, slipping an apron over his shoulders. He looked both awkward and at ease, like a man stepping into a part of himself that had always been there. And fair warning, he added with a grin, Mia made dessert. She calls them surprise cookies. Dinner was chaotic in the most endearing way. Mia chattered about school, her hands painting pictures in the air, while Daniel shared dry little stories about odd things he found during late-night cleaning shifts. Victoria listened, laughed, even reached for seconds of spaghetti that tasted far better than she expected. The secret ingredient, Daniel admitted sheepishly, was cinnamon against all logic. It worked. The cookies, an improbable mix of marshmallows, chocolate chips, and crumbled crackers, were messy but delightful. For the first time in years, Victoria felt herself relaxing without effort. No cameras, no shareholders, no need to perform, just a father, his daughter, and a table that felt fuller than her entire penthouse ever had. When Mia yawned over her glass of milk, Daniel ruffled her hair gently and sent her off to bed. "Brush your teeth," he called, his voice softened with affection. Soon, the apartment grew quiet, save for the hum of the old refrigerator. Victoria helped gather plates, her manicured hands drying dishes older than she was. She looked around at the chipped mug Daniel refused to throw away, the grocery list scrawled in 2 different handwritings, the silly flower Mia had tucked into a jar on the counter. "Thank you," she murmured. Daniel glanced up. "For what?" "For letting me see this," she said, her voice low, almost reverent. "Your real life." She gestured toward the clutter, the warmth, the love stitched into every corner. "It's not much," he replied, a little embarrassed, but she shook her head, her eyes glinting with something unguarded. "It's everything." The words hung between them as they stepped into the hallway, the soft sound of Mia settling into sleep behind her door. The distance closed almost without thought. Daniel's hand lingered at her waist, hesitant yet certain, and before either of them could name the moment, their lips met. The kiss was unplanned, unpracticed, yet devastatingly real. When they finally pulled apart, breathless, Victoria pressed her forehead against his chest, trembling. "This changes everything," she whispered. Daniel held her close, his voice rough. "Does it have to?" She pulled back, eyes bright with unshed tears. "You don't understand my world," she said, shaking her head. "It doesn't work like this. I can't just date someone. Every move I make is judged, twisted, used against me." Her confession cut through the sweetness like a blade. Daniel wanted to argue, to tell her the world didn't matter here, not in this little apartment where laughter and love were louder than power. But the truth pressed heavy against them both. They stood in the quiet, hearts racing, knowing that what had begun as a charade had crossed into something neither of them could undo, and the line between pretending and truth had disappeared altogether. The storm didn't break with thunder, but with the quiet click of polished shoes across Victoria's office floor. Marcus Voss, her CFO, leaned back in the chair opposite her desk as though it already belonged to him. He sat down a leather portfolio with deliberate calm, and when he opened it, the photographs spilled across the polished wood like evidence at a trial. "Telephoto lenses don't lie," he said smoothly. "The board has concerns. Victoria, a CEO meeting privately with a janitor, entering his apartment, kissing him in the hallway." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "It's not exactly the image our investors pay for." Victoria stared at the pictures, each one slicing into her like glass. Moments that had felt private, fragile, sacred, now reduced to ammunition. She kept her face still, but her pulse roared in her ears. "And it gets worse," Marcus continued, savoring the words. "Your mystery man, Daniel Ross, once an aerospace engineer, yes, but also a man with a criminal record. A bar fight, technically dismissed, but the stain remains. Add in a failed lawsuit, bankruptcy, a dead wife. Hardly the partner for a Hale." He leaned forward, his voice sharpening. "The choice is simple. End this distraction, or face a vote of no confidence. Monday morning, company or him." When the door closed behind Marcus, silence filled the office. Victoria sat frozen, the city skyline stretching behind her like a glittering jury. Company or him, legacy or love. The world she had spent her life holding together was about to demand she tear it apart. That night, she found Daniel at a diner tucked on the corner of a quiet street. He was already there, a cup of coffee cooling in front of him, his shoulders heavy with a weight he hadn't chosen. She slid into the booth across from him, her eyes searching his face. "Tell me," she said softly, "about the arrest." He stared into his cup as though the truth were written in its dark surface. His voice was low, almost ashamed. "It was nothing noble. A guy was hassling a waitress. He wouldn't take no for an answer. I stepped in. Things got ugly. The footage cleared me. Charges dropped, but the record stayed. And people see what they want to see." The story poured out, heavy and unvarnished. The lawsuit against his old firm after he exposed safety violations, the crushing legal fees, the career that vanished overnight, and then the accident. His wife gone in an instant, Mia left motherless. His life dismantled piece by piece until all that remained was a mop cart and a daughter who still looked at him like he was a hero. "I lost everything," he said simply, My job, my savings, my faith in the system. The only thing I had left was Mia. He finally lifted his eyes to hers. And now you know. Victoria's hand reached across the table, trembling, but Daniel gently pulled his back. His smile was tired, almost tender. Don't apologize for them using my past against you. Just don't make this harder than it already is. Her breath caught. What are you saying? I'm saying you should choose the company, he answered quietly. I won't let you throw away everything your parents built for someone like me. He stood before she could reply, tossing a few bills on the counter, his shoulders squared as if bracing against a storm. She watched him walk away through the rain-streaked window, her reflection fractured in the glass. Alone in the booth, she whispered the question that had no answer. What good was ruling an empire if it meant ruling it in silence? Monday dawned gray, the kind of Chicago rain that seeped into everything, even the corners of Horizon Tower that usually gleamed untouchable. Victoria stood before the mirror in her penthouse, the reflection staring back at her wrapped in immaculate armor, hair coiled perfectly, suit pressed into sharp lines, eyes cold enough to cut. But behind the mask, she saw what no one else could, the hollow echo of an empty home and the shadow of a man who had already walked away. Her parents' portraits lined the study wall, steady reminders of what Hale leadership was meant to be. Not ruthless, not lonely. They had built their legacy together, hand in hand, their partnership the foundation of everything. She had spent years believing she had to carry it alone. But now, standing on the brink of a boardroom war, she realized the truth they had tried to teach her. Power without love was nothing more than a prison gilded in glass. By 9, the boardroom was filled. 12 faces ringed the table, expectant, curious, some already written with judgment. At the far end, Marcus Voss sat with his usual smug calm, his documents arranged neatly before him. He looked like a man ready to claim her chair the moment she faltered. "Good morning," Victoria said evenly as she entered, leather portfolio tucked under her arm. She didn't sit right away. She let the silence stretch, commanding the room without raising her voice. "You've asked for my decision. Company or a personal life you consider unbecoming of a CEO." A ripple of discomfort crossed the table, but Marcus only smiled, certain he had her cornered. She opened her portfolio. "Before I answer, I think you should know how this information was gathered." Her fingers slid photographs across the table, the same ones Marcus had flaunted, now accompanied by security reports detailing unauthorized surveillance, falsified background checks, and a chain of emails that tied back to him. This was not due diligence. This was sabotage. Illegal, deliberate, and orchestrated by the man sitting across from me. The board murmured sharply, faces hardening. Marcus stiffened, but she pressed forward, her voice steady as steel. "You wanted me to choose, Marcus, so I have. I choose to expose you. I choose to protect the integrity of this company, the one my parents built, not on manipulation, but on trust." By noon, the vote was unanimous. Marcus was stripped of his position, his resignation demanded, his future dismantled in the same room where he had tried to dismantle hers. Security escorted him out, his portfolio left abandoned on the polished table. The directors turned to her with words of support, voices ringing with relief that Hale leadership remained intact. On paper, she had won. Her empire was safe, her crown secured. Yet, as Victoria sat alone in her office, the city sprawled beneath her like a circuit board of lights. The silence pressed heavier than ever. She thought of Daniel, his tired smile, his quiet strength, the way he had pulled his hand away in that diner, not because he didn't want her, but because he thought she deserved better. She thought of Mia's castle drawing with its wide-open door, and how easily children understood what adults spent lifetimes avoiding. The victory should have felt like triumph, but without him, it tasted hollow, like ash on her tongue. She had held her throne, but lost the only thing that had ever made her feel human. The days that followed felt heavier than the years Daniel had already carried. He kept his head down, pushing the mop cart through the same polished corridors, pretending that nothing had changed. But at night, in the quiet of his apartment, he couldn't silence the echo of her absence. He told himself he'd done the right thing, sparing Victoria from having to choose. Yet the hollow ache in his chest said otherwise. One evening, as he washed dishes while Mia scribbled at the kitchen table, her small voice broke the silence. Daddy, she asked, her tone so direct it startled him. Why did you tell Miss Hale she couldn't love us anymore? The plate slipped slightly in his hands, water splashing over the counter. What do you mean, sweetheart? He asked carefully. I heard you, she said simply. That night at the diner, you told her she had to choose her job instead of us. But Daddy, what if she didn't want to choose? What if she wanted to fight for us? Her words landed heavier than any boardroom threat ever could. Out of the mouths of children comes the truth adults are too afraid to face. Daniel sank into the chair across from her, staring at the crayon-streaked paper she was working on. Another drawing, this time a house with windows glowing yellow, 3 stick figures standing together, hands linked. At the bottom, in shaky block letters, she had written, "This is what love looks like." The next morning, Daniel made a decision that terrified him more than losing everything ever had. He called in sick, dropped Mia off at school, and for the first time in years, took the elevator to the 33rd floor, not to clean, but to find her. That afternoon, Victoria stood near the schoolyard gate, her sleek car out of place among the jumble of minivans and worn sedans. She spotted Mia first, backpack bouncing, braids flying, and then Daniel, striding across the lot. Their eyes locked across the distance, an entire conversation passing in silence before Mia bridged the gap. She seized both their hands with the certainty only a child could have. I told Daddy he was being silly, she announced proudly. I told him you would fight for us if he gave you the chance. Daniel's chest tightened as he looked down at his daughter, then up at Victoria. Something inside him gave way. His voice was quiet, almost broken. She's right. I was being selfish. I was so afraid of watching you sacrifice everything that I never asked what you wanted. He drew in a breath that felt like leaping off a cliff. So I'll ask now, what do you want, Victoria? Minutes later, they sat together in a corner booth of a small ice cream parlor, the kind with faded checkered tiles and sticky menus. Mia worked her way through a sundae nearly bigger than her head, blissfully unaware of the world holding its breath around her. Victoria reached into her bag and pulled out a folded piece of paper, creased, colored, worn at the edges. She spread it carefully on the table. It was Mia's drawing, the glowing house, the 3 figures, the words scrawled in a child's hand. I fought for us, she said simply, her hazel eyes glistening. When they tried to make me choose, I fought for the right to have both, the company and a family. I won, but it didn't feel like winning without you. She touched the drawing gently, smoothing the wrinkles with her fingertips. Your daughter gave us the blueprint. Maybe it's time we start building. Daniel stared at the picture, then at Victoria, and for the first time in years, hope rose in him. Not as a dream, but as something real, alive and waiting to be claimed. 6 months later, the little house on a quiet Chicago street hummed with the kind of music money could never buy. Morning sunlight spilled through thin curtains, catching on the piano keys as Mia practiced scales with the fierce concentration only a child could summon. In the kitchen, the scent of pancakes rose, warm and sweet, and Victoria stood at the stove with her hair tied loosely back, a wooden spoon tapping against the bowl in rhythm with the notes drifting down the hall. From the living room came the steady sound of tools against wood. Daniel knelt over a chair with a wobbly leg, humming under his breath as he worked. Every so often, Mia's laughter rang out when she hit the wrong key, and Victoria called back with gentle encouragement. It was a chorus of ordinary life, stitched together by the simplest of sounds, music, tools, and the clatter of plates being set for breakfast. On the refrigerator among Mia's newest drawings hung a framed document, the adoption finalized. The ink on the paper was dry, but for Mia, it had always been official. She had slipped once, calling Victoria Mom, and the name stuck like it had always belonged. Now it was part of their daily rhythm, as natural as asking for syrup or racing to the door when the mail arrived. Victoria still carried the weight of Hale leadership, her days filled with decisions that shaped thousands of lives. Yet for the first time, she measured her success differently, not by quarterly margins or glowing headlines, but by Saturday mornings like this, where the empire waited and the world slowed down enough for pancakes and piano lessons. She had learned that power could build towers, but love built homes that could weather any storm. Daniel glanced up from his repair, wiping his hands on a cloth, and caught Victoria watching him from the kitchen doorway. There was flour on her sweater, sunlight in her hair, and a softness in her smile that still startled him. She crossed the room, setting a plate of golden pancakes on the table, and for a moment they simply stood there, taking each other in as if remembering all the nights when this had seemed impossible. Mia bounded over, tugging their hands until they sat down beside her. "We're a real family now," she declared proudly, sliding her latest drawing across the table. A house glowing with yellow windows, 3 figures holding hands in front. Daniel chuckled, recognizing the echo of the first picture she had shown them months ago. "That's right, kiddo," he said, his voice thick with gratitude. "This is what love looks like." As breakfast filled the table with warmth, Victoria thought back to the night she had stood in her office, desperate enough to ask a stranger to pretend for 7 minutes. She smiled at the memory, shaking her head at how foolish it might have seemed, because what had begun as 7 borrowed minutes had become something infinite, a love not bound by performance, but by choice. And as laughter filled the little house, blending with the smell of syrup and the bright notes of a piano still learning its way, Victoria knew she had finally discovered the only definition of success that mattered. Not empires, not headlines, but family. In the captivating story of Victoria Hale, a formidable CEO isolated by her empire of glass and steel, and Daniel Ross, a humble janitor rebuilding life from the ashes of loss, we uncover a profound life lesson. True connection often blooms from the seeds of vulnerability, transcending the barriers of status, wealth, and pretense. Victoria, drowning in boardroom battles and empty penthouse nights, dares to ask Daniel, a man scarred by corporate betrayal, bankruptcy, and widowhood, to feign love for just 7 minutes at a gala, masking her loneliness from judgmental eyes. What begins as a charade unravels into raw authenticity, shared glances on a balcony, heartfelt confessions over spaghetti in his modest apartment, and the innocent wisdom of Daniel's daughter Mia, who draws castles with open doors to remind them that love isn't confined by walls. This tale tugs at the heartstrings, evoking tears for the quiet battles we all fight, against isolation, past traumas, and societal expectations, whispering that opening up, even in fleeting pretense, can forge unbreakable bonds. Daniel's steadfast dignity amid mockery and Victoria's fierce fight against sabotage prove that love isn't a transaction. It's a courageous choice to see beyond facades, embracing imperfections as the foundation of family. In a world obsessed with power and perfection, this narrative stirs the soul, urging us to drop our armor and invite genuine hearts into our lives. For what starts as 7 minutes of make-believe can evolve into a lifetime of profound belonging. If this story resonated with you, stirring memories of your own unexpected connections or acts of vulnerability that changed everything, share your experiences in the comments below. What moment taught you that love defies all odds? And don't forget to subscribe for more soul-stirring tales of hope, resilience, and human triumph. Your engagement keeps this community alive, one heartfelt story at a time.